Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Lemann. I'm the director of Columbia Global Reports, and we're here to talk about our latest book, which is called What's Prison For? It's by Bill Keller. The subtitle is Punishment and Rehabilitation in the Age of Mass Incarceration. Let me just say a word about Columbia Global Reports. We're a small publishing house at Columbia University. We published our first book in September 2015. We're now up to about book 40. Our program is we publish short books on big topics that aren't getting enough coverage in the mainstream press. This is Bill's book. You can see they're all sort of this size. We're a nonprofit publisher, so we rely not only on book sales, but on support from foundations, individuals, and our readers, and Columbia University, and we're very grateful for that. If you want to learn more about us, you can go on our website. That's globalreports.columbia.edu and see what our upcoming books are. And we almost always do an event like this for every book, so you'll have plenty of that and other opportunities to interact with us. I want to introduce our panelists tonight. First is Bill Keller, our author. Bill is a longtime journalist. I think I met Bill in about 1977, and he spent 30 years of his career at the New York Times, including many roles, executive editor, that is the top editor of the paper, columnist, foreign correspondent in South Africa, and Moscow during eventful times in both countries. After he retired from the Times, he was the founding editor of the Marshall Project, which is another one of this new generation, like us at Columbia Global Reports, of nonprofit news organizations that are covering in-depth issues that don't get the attention they deserve from the mainstream press. So he was the founding editor of that, and then retired from that, and then decided to do the one thing in journalism he had never done, almost the one thing, which is write a book. So he wrote this book for us, which is kind of inspired by his experience at the Marshall Project, but enriched by additional reporting. Let me start, Bill, by asking you, let me introduce our other panelists and bring them on, and then start by asking you a little bit about the book. Emily Bazelon is a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine and Truman Capote Fellow for Creative Writing and Law at Yale Law School. She's written a book called Charged, which is about criminal justice, and she also has run something called the Prison Letters Project, also about criminal justice, and done a great deal of wonderful journalism that isn't necessarily about criminal justice as well. Vivian Nixon is here at Columbia University, where she's writer in residence at Columbia Justice Lab's Square One project. She co-leads the Racial Justice and Abolition Democracy Project in collaboration with the Initiative for a Just Society, and she's guiding the development of Square One project's work on racial reckoning. So, Bill, how much did you know about criminal justice? How much had you thought about it before you came to the Marshall Project?
I never covered criminal justice unless you count a few months covering night cops for the Oregonian, which was what every rookie reporter had to do. So I came to it quite fresh.
Were you surprised by what you found?
Yes, I was surprised that it was as bad as it is. And I was surprised at how many people are actually making an effort to make it better.
And what gave you the idea to write this book in particular?
Well, the Marshall Project covers the whole gamut of criminal justice institutions, policing, the courts, prosecutors. those all do their thing with the public watching. Prisons are a little more mysterious by design. I mean, the walls that are designed to keep people in are also designed to keep people out, including nosy reporters. So the prisons are not models of transparency. And I wanted to, I'm not a scholar or an advocate, but I wanted to write a kind of primer on what goes on behind the walls in prisons and what efforts are underway to do a better job of it.
Before we get to what goes on inside prison, just take a minute. Where are we in the story of mass incarceration in America? Is that phrase salient to you? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? Where are we in this story?
It's still at the stage of being pretty bad. I mean, for most of the 20th century, there was a stable, comparatively high, but not outlandishly high rate of incarceration, something around 100 incarcerated people for every 100,000 population. In the 60s and 70s, we took a sharp punitive turn, and at the maximum, it was about 500 incarcerated people for 100,000 population. The high water mark was in 2008. It's been going down a little bit since then, but it's still we're an outlier in the world.
In terms of having a very high prison population.
Right.
What does it say about America that we do this? Why do we do this?
We have a 200-year history of tension between, to be a little glib about it, I think of it as sort of Quaker America and Puritan America. We have in our Quaker phase a couple hundred years ago, we more or less invented the modern penitentiary, including the word penitentiary, which implies a place where people can do their penance and make themselves better. And over the centuries, we've gone back and forth, emphasizing punishment, emphasizing rehabilitation, until, as I said, the 60s or 70s, when for a number of reasons, we took a sharp turn towards punishment.
So I guess the title of the book is What is Prison For? What should prison be for, in your view? What ought to happen inside prison? Well,
scholars tend to think of prisons as having four justifications. One of them is punishment, and I think I'm not disavowing the notion of punishment. It's even the most progressive societies on earth have some concept of punishment. Incapacitation is the second ostensible reason for it, and that means there's a logic to that. When crime rate goes down, as it did dramatically not too long ago, when crime goes down, one of the factors seems to be that we're putting more people in jail. Deterrent is the third ostensible reason, and deterrent is, well, first of all, it assumes that people stop and calculate the consequences of their crime. A lot of crime is more spontaneous or done in a group than that. But it also ignores the fact that prison can make people more criminally inclined. There's lots of evidence to back that up. Anyway, the fourth reason is rehabilitation, which we try to do episodically, I would say. But the recidivism rates suggest that we don't do it very well.
In the book, you really make a heartfelt and hopeful case for rehabilitation. And, I don't want to go through everything in the book in great detail, but could you give a couple of examples of the places you saw where you felt you're seeing rehabilitation and it's working? What happens?
Well, the most obvious one, and this is something that Vivian will want to talk about, I'm sure, is education. That's reliable data in the criminal justice area is always hard to come by. It always comes with caveats. But some of the best research and rehabilitation efforts has been done by the RAND Corporation, which has studied college level education and demonstrated a pretty dramatic drop in recidivism among people who get a college degree in prison. There's a saying that I heard more than once from corrections officials that if you've seen one prison, you've seen one prison. I mean, every prison has its own culture, and some of them have nurtured successful rehabilitation programs, and some of them don't even really make much of an effort.
Vivian, you want to respond on education in prisons?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity. The research on education in prisons tells us a lot about education. Yes, it absolutely tells us that those who have access to college level programming in prisons do much better, but that's along a spectrum. It goes from those who complete even graduate degrees in prisons, and that this was very possible before 1994 when the Bill Clinton Crime Act took Pell Grants away as part of a much larger agenda for crime. It was possible to get multiple levels of degree. But there is some research, a small study done in a women's prison in New York, Bedford Hills, called Changing Minds by Michelle Fine, says that even exposure to one college class made a difference to women who were coming out of prison. And when I entered the picture, really, I was a prisoner at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility and was devastated to learn that though I had looked forward to, after sitting in county jail, wasting away for a year, to enrolling in college, learned that I would be transferred to a different prison where there was no college. And that was a really devastating experience for me. I then began to teach and tutor general education classes for people who had no literacy skills at all. But the bottom line is even a little bit of education works. And over the years, many people who have been in prison and exposed to just a little bit of education have been the fiercest advocates to bring education back into the prisons and to also make it part of the reentry process.
Vivian, how important do you think it is that Pell Grants are coming back for incarcerated students?
I think it's incredibly important. I've worked on it since 2004. So I think it's incredibly important, even in a world where we're talking about abolition and the different views of what that means. I think that investing in better conditions and the opportunity for self-improvement for those who are still incarcerated as we work toward a better world where maybe we don't need to incarcerate this many people, I think is a fabulous thing. Yes.
So let me go back to you for a moment and ask you to describe kind of in more detail some of the places that you saw that have, I guess you paint a picture that is not familiar to people like me who have seen prison movies and so on, where there's a lot more trust in prisoners and so on. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. You're talking about the places that have tried to adapt the European models?
Yes. And yeah. What is the European model and what does that look like? Yeah.
In the last 15 years or so, there's been a great number of exchange programs. A lot of them arranged by institutions like the Vera Institute. Exchange programs for corrections officials between the United States and Norway and Germany are big. All of the Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands. Each of those countries has a slightly different approach, but what they share is a common philosophy, which is if you commit a crime, you're going to be punished. Your punishment is that you're not free to go anywhere for some set period of time. Your freedom of movement is limited, and that's it. Your other rights as a citizen are retained, including the right to education, the right to have a decent wage if you have a prison job, the right to conjugal visits, the right to vote. And the role of the prison is seen as diagnosing what factors caused each individual prisoner to commit a crime, and then using the time that you've got their full attention to help work on those, whether it's anger management or drug addiction or whatever the cause, or just poverty, to address and to have them leave with some skills and attitudes that would make them better citizens and neighbors when they get out.
And in terms of the texture of daily life, people don't spend their whole day locked up in a cell behind bars in these kinds of prisons, right?
Right. There's much more like a college campus, and it's extremely important that the people take responsibility for their own daily schedule. It's just even cooking their own breakfast or ironing their own shirts. They wake up. They're responsible for waking themselves up, getting to class or the job, whichever they're doing, and just they have to put aside a certain amount of their pay to make sure that they're not leaving the prison with an empty pocket. Obviously we're not Norway, or even close, but the philosophy, a number of places in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, North Dakota, and Oregon are the ones where I talk to corrections officials, have tried to adopt the philosophy and the sense of responsibility.
Emily, I want to ask you, prisons are institutions that are bound up in the legal system and the political system. What is the state of play in those systems about all these issues that we've been talking about so far? Are we past the mass incarceration moment, or not so much?
Well, we've had this period of some gradual decline from our absolute heights of mass incarceration, but no, I don't think we're past it. I mean, the numbers are still, I think, over 2 million people, and that doesn't count the many more millions of people who are churning through jails and shorter stays that can be very disruptive to people's lives and interfere with their ability to have a job, take care of their kids. Sometimes they lose their housing. I think we're very much still living in that era. And we're also living in a moment where there is a rise in some violent crime in some parts of the country, and I think a perception of more of a rise than is actually happening. That's sort of a consistent finding about Americans, is that they tend to exaggerate the degree to which crime is on the rise and is a threat. And I worry a lot about the impact of that. I mean, when you look back over the last several decades, I don't think you really see a period in which we've succeeded in decreasing incarceration, much less bigger reforms of the kind that Bill and Vivian are talking about, when there was this perception of crime being on the rise. And so that dynamic, which we're very much seeing play out in our political system with the November election, is really one to watch out for. And when you look at some of the ads that are running against candidates like John Fetterman, who's running for Senate in Pennsylvania, you see Republican candidates really trying to latch on to the sphere of crime that they perceive among suburban voters. And if it seems like that's a winning tactic for them, then I think you're going to see a push for even more punitive policies than the ones that we have in place.
I would add, Democratic candidates are not immune to this either. There was an ad I recently saw from Senator Maggie Hassan of New Hampshire, where most of the ad is police officers going on camera and saying how much they love her because she fights for more cops on the streets and tougher approach on crime and so on. So Democrats are also running on these issues. Unanswerable question, but I can't resist asking them. How much of this is about crime and how much of it is about race?
There's a chapter in my book called "What's Race Got to Do with It?" And if I had to sum it up in three words, the answer would be just about everything. I mean, so much about our criminal justice system, and particularly our incarceration system, has its roots in slavery by way of Jim Crow, by way of the loophole in the 13th Amendment that says slavery is abolished except for people convicted of serious crimes. I've been accused of being surprisingly optimistic on the state of the criminal justice system, which I guess I'm optimistic about the possibility of doing something. But the problem, you can't be optimistic about changing the whole system because it acts as a sort of catchment area for all of the poisonous problems of society at large, including racism, including poverty, including bad education and bad health care. All of the poisons of those shortcomings flow into the prison system. And until you can do something about that tsunami, reform is likely to be incremental and piecemeal. I'm in favor of incremental and piecemeal reforms, don't get me wrong, but I don't expect a magic transformation as long as we serve this role as a sort of sewer for society.
Do the other panelists have comments on this?
I do, and just a slightly different take. There is a tremendous connection between the particular racial history of the United States and our penchant for punishment and our penchant for punishing certain groups of people. And if we look at the cycle of recidivism of a thing called backlash, every time there is some progress in issues of racial justice, for instance, post-Reconstruction, the emergence of the Black codes, and after civil rights is really when the prison boom began. And post-Obama, we saw early on some bipartisan cooperation, but now at the slightest rise in crime, which could have many, many reasons, including, COVID, which has to take some responsibility, is now showing up again as how do we get this population back under control. But what I've learned over the years, because 20 years ago when I started this work, I would have just thrown everything into the bucket of this is a racial issue. It always has been. I have learned from really good colleagues and friends, many of whom are mentioned in your book, Bill, that you have to also look at the hardcore data, who's being affected, what's going on in the economy. Bruce Weston talks a lot about the social inequality of all of the systems that have failed us that you mentioned. And as long as we ignore those systems and just focus on race, we're going to be stuck in kind of this battle regarding what do we do about racism. I think reckoning with our racial history is an important question and one critical to moving to a world where we incarcerate the minimum amount of people possible, but it can't be done absent of trying to examine and fix our other social systems that cause a great gap in wealth, housing, healthcare, and other social issues.
Emily, do you want to come in on this?
I mean, just to back up what Bill and Vivian are saying, when you look at every stage of the criminal system, you see racial disparities. So Black people get disproportionately arrested for crimes that white people commit at equal rates, for example, drug crimes. Then you see racial disparity in terms of what happens at the bail stage, what happens when people are plea bargaining, when they're convicted, when they try to appeal their sentences, when they're punished. There's just this kind of built-in effect of racism everywhere along the way, and it's tremendously dispiriting. At the same time, I agree with Vivian that it's really important to recognize that there are lots and lots of white people and people of all races in prison and jail in America. And I sometimes worry that when we only talk about it through a lens of race, we make other people feel like they don't have to worry about this because it's about those other people over there who maybe they're suspicious of anyway. And that whole sort of othering of people is one of the reasons why we're not Norway, like Bill said. And so I think it's just really important, just as Vivian was doing, to emphasize the kind of class dimension of this. There should be a sense of class solidarity about people who are fighting to end mass incarceration. And there is increasingly, in the last maybe 5 to 8 years, a recognition among conservatives that the amount of money that the country is spending on locking people up is a tremendous waste of resources. It's just a really bad return on investment when you have all this recidivism that we've been discussing. So I take some glimmer of hope in that. And another thing that a scholar at the University of Michigan, Eko Yanka, said to me the other day is that he's studying the way in which the decarceration we're seeing is actually benefiting Black defendants more, because basically there are more of them in prison. And so once you start along a decarceration path, you're going to see some additional benefit, especially because we're seeing more of a change in urban areas than in rural ones. And so just based on the patterns of where people live and the current patterns of incarceration, there is some extra benefit there. And that is one, I think, kind of silver lining to consider.
Bill, let me pick up on one thread, from what Emily was saying. In the book, you talk somewhat about bipartisan prison reform and that the impulse, even though, as Emily noted, you're more likely to see crime, and more crime in Republican ads in this political season than Democratic ads, that there's some degree of Republican and conservative and libertarian support for ending mass incarceration or reducing it. So could you talk about that a little?
Sure. Back in 2015, I wrote a piece for The New Yorker about the right-wing prison reform movement, which consisted of some fairly high-powered people, like the Koch brothers were bankrolling indigent defense. I actually went to a conference that was co-hosted by the Koch brothers and the ACLU. And it's not hard to understand why when you think about it. I mean, if you're a libertarian-leaning type who thinks that we're all being abused by the law, the heavy fist of government, then why would you exempt the corrections department from that indictment? There were a portion of the evangelical constituency that was concerned about the inhumane treatment of prisoners. There were others who were just, like Newt Gingrich was part of this alliance for a while, just because he's kind of a policy wonk, and as Emily said, the return on investment wasn't worth it. That movement has been muted in really, because like everything else, it's run into the polarizing influence of Trumpism, and now there's a political campaign where they're opportunistically yelling crime, crime, crime. But there is an underlying logic for there being some common ground on things like mandatory sentencing and compassionate release and raising the age to be treated as an adult, and a lot of other measures that could reduce the incarceration rates.
Let's zoom in a little bit on what you would calling the European style rehabilitation-oriented way of running prisons. And I want to ask you and all of you to speculate about, I think it accurately reflects the book, and if it doesn't, please correct me, that this is not the dominant form of imprisonment in the U.S. at this point. It's the green shoots stage, right? So what's the political, economic, et cetera, likelihood of those kinds of programs becoming the norm?
There are a lot of challenges in the way of those practices being catching on as the norm. I mean, the one that's obviously implicit in our discussing of the campaign season politics is that it's politically can be a hard sell. The biggest obstacle is cost. In Germany, if you're going to be a corrections officer, you're going to attend 2 years of sort of college level studies that include courses in human rights law and psychology. If you're going to be a corrections officer in the States, you're going to get a few weeks of training, mostly in crowd control and self-defense. And the ratios are in the Scandinavian countries and Germany are something like two inmates per officer, and the officers see their role as more social workers than paramilitary. But that costs a lot, and even places like Connecticut, which modeled a one wing of a youth facility on lessons learned from Germany. The corrections official and the governor who sponsored that program are no longer in office. The successors support those programs that have been developed, but they are under pressure to cut their budgets, and they're not going to be scaling those experiments into something really large.
What are the ratios like in the U.S.?
Well, officially, there's, I think, 5-to-1 at the federal level and 10-to-1 at the state level. I haven't checked the numbers lately, so I may be off by a bit. But in practical terms, I've talked to corrections officers who were, at least for a portion of the day, responsible for 50 people. It doesn't make for a lot of constructive interaction. It's just warehousing.
What I haven't seen, but maybe I'm missing something, and maybe there just isn't enough of this yet, is, ads and other things like that, kind of demagoguing against rehabilitation programs in prison. So they seem not to be in the crosshairs as much. But am I missing something?
I'm not aware of anybody yet capitalizing on these experiments. The experiments are mostly pretty small. There has been resistance in a lot of states from the organizations, the unions that represent corrections officers, who tend to be change averse.
Let's talk about after prison and what that experience is like and how it could be improved. I'll start with you, Vivian.
It is not the same for everyone. It varies tremendously according to how many resources you have access to. What your life was before prison, what you had access to during prison, and what's available in your community when you get home. And I consider myself to be among one of the very luckiest. I had a fairly decent life prior to prison. I kept myself busy tutoring others while I was incarcerated and had a lot of family support when I came home. But that's not the way it is for everybody. For most people, going to prison is the result of years of economic difficulty, trauma, mental, physical, sexual abuse, lack of education, and all of the things that make one feel that they are among the not wanted in our society. And that makes it all the harder to pull oneself up by the straps on non-existent boots. So if there's nothing inside of the prison to really help people find themselves and find value in who they are, it's almost impossible to come out and then face all of the collateral consequences of conviction. Another thing that is unique to the United States is once your prison sentence is officially over, the consequences do not end. You're no longer, you don't lose your freedom. You're no longer under that category of, well, we've got to deter or punish this person, but the punishment really does continue. in things like not being able to get a license for certain jobs, not being able to participate in certain housing or other federal assistance programs, having to always identify yourself as someone who has a felony conviction, which makes people have a certain perception of who you are. So the reentry process can vary, but for the majority, the vast majority of people, is extremely difficult.
Emily?
One thing I would just add to that, I agree with everything Vivian has said, but one thing you hear from people who were formerly incarcerated is that, yes, they had a reentry program. They were lucky to be in one of the institutions that had a reentry program. It started 3 months before their release date. They'd been in for 20 years, and nobody had been paying any attention to the fact that someday these people are going to get out.
Yeah, and we should also add to the mix not being allowed to vote, which is the case in many states. Emily.
That's true. Well, I mean, I've written about people who've had no reentry program or services at all, and it's just so awful to watch. It's so destructive for people to come home and have no resources and no help and no money. And it also is bad for the rest of us because it sets them up for failure. And instead of thinking of prison as this time where you're trying to make people better equipped to be productive citizens, we generally do little to nothing to making things worse because there is such a lack of the kinds of education programs that Vivian and Bill are talking about. And then they get out and they're just sort of left to their own devices, even though, of course, it's harder to find a job and housing, and maybe your relationship with your family is frayed by the time you've come home. And there are all of these things that make people, I think, feel like the dice is really stacked against them. And this is a part of the whole picture that we don't pay as much attention to, but it causes enormous pain for people's lives. And I think it also damages their communities.
How, for all of you, there's this word that's means some things to some people and other things to other people, abolition. How should we understand that word?
Well, for me, it exists on a spectrum. There's a lot of use of the word these days. And I think one of the struggles that I'm having now is it may be causing some infighting among people who are really on the same side. Dreaming of a world where prisons are not necessary I think it's a worthwhile endeavor. But as we move there, we need to be thinking of, is it really just about what we call facilities? Are we really saying that there could be a world where no one ever commits an offense that is so harmful, so dangerous that we have to deter them, we have to incapacitate them for a period of time? I don't believe that's true. I think that, human nature is that there's going to be a need to protect some of us from people who have lost their way for some reason. But that treatment doesn't have to be all about punishment, and punishment doesn't have to mean causing more harm. It can mean holding people accountable, having consequences for your actions, and we need to figure out what that looks like. And what I want abolitionists who believe that we can never incapacitate anybody for any reason, what I want to see for them is what that looks like. And I haven't seen that yet. I do believe that the smallest amount humanly possible need to be incapacitated in order to keep others safe. But we need to make, as a society, we need to make firm decisions about who those people are and where there are other ways to hold people accountable besides taking away their freedom.
Bill, you were going to say something about this?
As you were talking, Vivian, I was just remembered an interview I read with Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, probably the most influential book on the subject in the last 20 years. She was asked if she considered herself an abolitionist. And she said, yes, I consider myself an abolitionist. I believe we should abolish prisons as they are now. I'm slightly paraphrasing, but so you're right. There's a spectrum of abolitionism that doesn't always look like outright abolition. The problem I have with the abolitionists is that sometimes the perfect becomes the enemy of the good. A lot of abolitionists backed the conservative forces who wanted to stop Bill de Blasio from closing Rikers Island because the plan entailed building 4 new, more humane jails in the boroughs. And that was probably de Blasio's single most radical act, his 2 terms as mayor.
Emily, do you want to add to this?
I mean, I hear Vivian about the division. I also think a lot of people kind of stub their toe on a word that appears to mean something different from what Michelle Alexander offered, right? I mean, what Michelle Alexander offered sounds to me like Norway or Germany. And I think the literal interpretation of abolition sounds like no prisons at all and nowhere to incapacitate people who are harmful. And I think most people balk at that idea and find it pretty alienating and unrealistic. And so I worry it's sort of a different way in which the term is the perfect is an enemy of the good. And that kind of concerns me for political reasons as one tries to broaden the appeal and the movement behind like radical change. I mean, Norway would be a totally different picture than we have in the United States. And so it just seems like there is a better framework and rhetoric for that might actually get us there.
Right. And even if you can wrap your mind or stimulate your imagination to see a day when violence disappears and we don't need police and prisons anymore, I'm skeptical that that's possible. But if it were possible, it would get here in a matter of generations. In the meantime, what do you do with the millions of people who are suffering from the system as it is?
I'm going to start reading questions from people in the audience. These were submitted in advance. I want to note that we do these sessions frequently, as I said, and this session has gotten more advanced questions than any we've ever done. Some of this the material and the questions we've covered already, but I'm just going to read a few questions now. Let's talk about churches. I have a question about religion and churches, both inside and outside prison, before, during, and after. Anybody have any thoughts on the role of religious institutions in all this? No?
Well, Bill talks in his book about some of the work that was done by a group of teachers and prisoners in Indiana who kind of dug up a very religious-based program that created tremendously difficult working conditions for women incarcerated in Indiana called Magdalene laundries, right? So religions have been involved in the business of punishment for a very long time, thinking that somehow punishment would lead to piety. There's some of that that still goes on today. It's, punishing people for their own good mentality. On the other hand, many denominations and churches are the most present volunteers inside of the prisons that exist today. They go in and provide services, religious services sometimes, counseling services, and supports. Same is true in the reentry process. You have a variety. You have those who are using their moral authority to kind of tell people what they ought to do, think, and feel, and others who are just trying to help people who are in need.
That doesn't just apply to Christians either. There's been a fair amount of volunteerism on the part of Muslim congregations, which is important because Islam is a force in a lot of prisons.
I've gone to prisons in Texas and Louisiana where the only volunteers and the only real kind of educational services, also in Tennessee, were coming from religious organizations.
I have a series of questions about healthcare, and I'm just going to sort of blend a little bit. What is healthcare like inside prison? In particular, drug treatment. Does that take place inside prison? In reentry, is that part of the picture? So anybody wants to talk about that? Or maybe several of you.
Well, this is
well,
where,
as Bill.
I'm just going to say this is where the line about if you've seen one prison, you've seen one prison comes in handy. It ranges from abysmal sub-third world healthcare, almost aggressively indifferent, to some places that have found a decent contractor. Mostly health facilities are contracted out, part of the privatization of our incarceration system. But I hesitate to generalize about the situation, except that it's probably more bad than good.
Yeah, I was going to point to that same exact quote, one prison is one prison. But there's something that only occurred to me and to my colleagues during COVID, when people were dying in prisons at horrible rates and the care was abysmal. One thing you could do is have kind of the same health emergency response plans in prisons that we do everywhere else. There is no mandate at any level, local, state, or federal, for facilities that incarcerate people to have emergency plans for any type of health emergency, including a public health emergency or a hurricane or anything else. And that's why you had people standing on bridges in the middle of Katrina. So one thing that is related to this is the establishment of emergency plans in correctional facilities. And there's legislation out there right now to do that.
One, just to return to the drug treatment, there's a kind of bitter theological divide in that world between the harm reduction people and the, total abstinence people. Who's winning in both, inside and outside the prison system for incarcerated people and formerly incarcerated?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Nobody. Okay.
Depends on the state.
Okay.
Depends on whether or not the state embrace, the expansion of Medicaid so that people can get access to these newer drugs, especially the drugs that treat opioid addiction.
I mean, I think one thing I would bring in that's related to your question, Nick, though I also don't know the answer, is that often there's very little access to drug treatment in jail as opposed to prison. And that really makes no sense because those are the folks who are going to go home sooner. And there is this opportunity to offer drug treatment and potentially really help people. And that just seems to me like such a misguided gap that so often exists in our services when there is an opportunity, for both longer-term drug treatment and also drugs like Suboxone to be available that can really save people's lives and help them make that initial step out of withdrawal and addiction.
Excuse me, I have a series of questions about public sentiment about prisons. So we can spend a few minutes on that. I'll read the first one, in verbatim just to give you the flavor, but they're all variations on a theme, and I might read a couple of others in a minute. How do you get people to feel anything for prisoners other than vengeance in a social media shaped landscape that delights in highlighting the idiocy and or mendacity of random people? And you don't have to answer that in exactly those terms, but you know where we're going with this. Thoughts on this?
Where we're going with this is the complicity of the mass media. It's not just social media, but the mainstream media has at times been part of the problem and not part of the solution. I mean, it's the cliche of local TV news. If it bleeds, it leads. Crime stories are likely to come with interesting footage. Cops are good sources, and they can manipulate the outcome of a story. I like to think that there's been a shift in that. The Marshall Project is part of that, but not by any means the only one. I think we're getting, I sense, more serious attention being paid to both the abysmal conditions inside prisons and efforts to do things like limit solitary confinement and reduce the use of cash bail. There have been some pretty smart reported pieces on those subjects.
I guess the larger thing I'm trying to get at is, what people call othering sometimes. The idea that can you do anything, or has anyone done anything that meaningfully reduces the psychological gulf between people who aren't justice involved and people who are justice involved, to have less othering, more compassion, more understanding, more inclusion? Is that working anywhere?
Well, I'll, to follow up with Bill, the example that the Marshall Project is setting is that they're not only looking at the positive end of this, the data, the research, the history. They are pulling out narratives that tell the lives of people, the stories of people who have been impacted by the justice system in ways that help people see themselves in these stories. One of the questions I often ask people who are all gun-ho for prisons and people get what they deserve. If you do the crime, you do the time. I explain, well, if you really understood crime reporting data, you understand that there's a minuscule amount of crime that's actually ever even reported, much less prosecuted and punished. So crime is all around us all the time, unaddressed. This may not be the solution, but also take a moment and think about if by some magic, your son, your daughter, your husband, your sister got caught up in the criminal justice system for some reason, how would you want them to be treated? And then take a look at what's going on behind the walls of our prison system and ask yourself, would I be comfortable with that if this were my relative? And people sometimes will take a breath and say, never thought about it that way.
Bill, I imagine that everything that you've advocated for in this book and that we've been talking about, how would I put this? There's X number of politicians who are, and public officials generally, who are sympathetic to what you're saying, but who are afraid of the issue. So let me first say, have I got that right?
Yes.
Who isn't afraid of the issue? Who's been a leader on this and really spoken out? Oh,
you've got some prosecutors who have spoken out. Members of Congress. Cory Booker is relentless on the subject of humanizing the people who are caught up in the criminal justice system. I think he may have a constituency that's used to him talking about this subject because he's been talking about it even before he was in the Senate. But members of Congress aren't profiled in courage, and the polling data suggests that people, even when crime isn't the most salient issue and it's not one of the top 2 or 3 concerns, it's always there. And it represents a third rail to a lot of politicians.
Right.
Go ahead, Emily.
Well, I was just going to add, I think often missing in action are mayors and governors, even in cities that have prosecutors who've been elected on progressive platforms. Often the mayors have been unwilling to really back them up. And that's an important sort of signal of leadership. And then I think there's also the salience of reform. So even when we were having crime really drop a few years ago, that didn't mean that, continuing with that decrease and all the related important reforms and emphasis on rehabilitation was uppermost in a lot of voters' minds. And so one thing I often say to people when they ask how they can help with this issue is ask your local elected officials about it. Make it clear that this is something that helps determine your vote, because I think that they are more likely to hear from people on the other side.
Vivian, how did incarceration change you as a person?
Oh, how much time do you have?
Not much. We're getting to the end, but
it changed me so much. I'm writing a book about it. It changed my perception of who I am as a person, and it made me conscious every minute of every day of how I'm perceived by the rest of the world, because it really is a scarlet letter that doesn't go away in American society. Your record is permanent and public, and there's always some consequence that comes up even 20 years later, 25 years later. I know that if I want to go and buy a co-op or a condo in New York City, I'm going to be asked whether or not I have a felony conviction. Not whether or not I have one, in the past year or 5 years or 10 years, ever in my life. So it's impacted me on a very deep level. And I'm trying to figure out whether or not this really is something I have to live with for the rest of my life and what that says about our society. It's also changed the way I think about people that I would have judged at one point in my life. I went to prison at a fairly older age. I was 37. And prior to that, I had a life and a job and a really good family. And I judged a lot of people who did things that I didn't approve of. And I saw them in a certain way. And that's something I try not to do anymore. So it changed me for the better in that way.
Bill, I'll ask you a variant of the same question as we're sort of running out of time. How did Marshall Project and this book change you?
That's a good question. And I think any answers I give you are going to sound like cliches. But what influenced me the most was meeting incarcerated people and formerly incarcerated people. I tend to think if there was the answer to your earlier question about how do you do away with the othering of people is you meet them, you encounter them. And I've got a long list of people who I've met who completely destroyed any caricature of what somebody in prison is supposed to be like. They're people with a sense of purpose, people with authority, people who've, upon getting out, have succeeded in small businesses. And we have 3 formerly incarcerated people working for us at the Marshall Project. And they're, I guess, sort of ambassadors for the people who are inside.
We're right at the end of our hour, unfortunately, but I want to thank all of you very much for participating. Thanks to the audience, too. Thank you, Bill, for writing such a wonderful book. And, we'll be back. So please remember, we're at globalreports.columbia.edu. Keep an eye on us. We've got lots and lots of good books in the pipeline.